Good morning. Hello. Sorry for being so late. Um, Actually, I don't even have a very good excuse. My wall clock battery died, so I didn't even realize it was as late as it was. So I'm back, and I'm glad you're here. Let me just finish setting up my screen here, because everything goes a little wonky once I hit the live button. Uh, there we go. So today, my plan is to talk about shallow water. So when we have shallow water, we have light and we have shadows, and we can see under the surface to a certain point, and then we get to a point where we can no longer see under the water. So let me show you our examples so that you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the example that I'm going to use. This was at the shore of a cottage here, and you can see when you're looking at this that we've got lots and lots of light hitting the water surface, so it's acting like a mirror, and we can actually see the sky in the water. Then we have this area here where it's in shadow and we can actually see through the water. So this part acts like a mirror. This part acts like a window. So we can actually see into the water. Now there's something else about this that I want to point out, and that is relative value. Okay, so what I mean by relative value is that this area being very light makes this area quite dark by comparison. However, over here, it's the reverse. We have light in this area against dark in the water. So for that reason, we need to really consider our approach. What are we going to paint first? Let's start with a drawing. That'll be a good place to start. Is it possible to go from shadow to light in watercolor? Occasionally, yes, that will work. Sometimes I will put in my shadows. For example, if I am painting fabric and the fabric has a lot of pattern or texture on it, I might put those shadows in first. Where the actual folds of the fabric are, creating dips and or peaks and valleys, it will create shadows. And I might put that in first, because if I put a lot of detail on first, it would be really difficult to try and work around all of that detail. Of course, that goes back to putting on detail before shadows, right? You always want to do your wet washes first. So let's just get the general feeling here. I've got some branches that come down here, and you can see I'm just kind of lightly sketching them on. And as I'm sketching this on, I'll tell you about the materials I'm going to be using. I am working on a watercolor block. This one is Arches 140-pound cold pressed paper. And I'll be using mainly DaVinci watercolors, but any professional grade watercolors are good. The professional grade always has a little bit more pigment to filler ratio, right? So we don't have as many fillers and things like that. So you can see my sketch is going to be quite rough here. When I do landscape painting, I tend to go a little more casual with my drawing because of the organic nature of things in landscapes. Okay, then we have a lot of rocks, and I am not going to start by drawing every single rock. That's just kind of crazy. I do have one large rock right here. Let's move this over so we can maybe have both on the screen at the same time, although we do have the one here on the corner. If you want a copy of this particular reference picture, I can enlarge it on the screen for you for just a moment. You can take a screenshot, and you can do it that way. I also have this picture posted on my Facebook page under the post where I've got this video or this live stream posted. So I've got it under the comments there. All right, so you can't see my drawing. My drawing is usually pretty light. Maybe I'll do it just a little bit darker so you can get a better idea. The waves are coming in on this sort of a light curve. And so I'm kind of following that direction for my drawing. And there's this big rock down here at the bottom. So I'll just indicate that. You can see all I did was I put in a shape. I'm not going to put in all of the detail. Sharon's asking, is it better to paint on bright white watercolor paper when water is in the photo? It depends on probably your reference picture, but I tend to paint most things on bright white paper. I always feel like I can warm up the paper with a wash of something warmer, but I can't cool it down very easily. So I would say yes, because water is generally speaking, is predominantly in the blue family. So being a cool color, the bright white is a cool white, and that would go together better. So if you have a question for me, by the way, be sure and put it in capitals because I can spot it a lot more easily. So thanks for doing that, Sharon. And let's start getting our paints wet. As I said, I'm using mostly DaVinci watercolors, but any artist quality will do. I've got here a small brush, but I'm not going to use that because it's far too small. I'm going to be covering most of the paper here. The only thing I might work around is this here. If I made, and I'm going back to values here again, because one thing I've noticed in some of my recent classes is that there's not enough attention paid to how bright or how light things are, and the effect of painting on white paper versus painting on a previously painted color. So if I were to use this coloring underneath this, that would change its value. Sure, I could add yellow to it and it would turn green, but it would end up looking darker because I don't think that this is any lighter than this. I think they're pretty close in value, but if I underpaint with blue and then I put yellow on top, things are going to start getting darker than I want them to be. So what I will do, I'm going to start with a very large, what is this? This is a number 6 brush. It's a squirrel hair brush that I'm using, but anything that holds lots of paint and water will be good. And I'm going to go with, that looks like a cobalt to me. So I'm going to go with a cobalt here in my water. So I'm making my puddle. I always pull my paint into my mix area. I'm going to use another clean brush, any brush to wet the paper. So I'm going to wet the paper, but I'm not going to wet this area here where I have the tree. I can wet up here because those branches are much darker. Now it might surprise you, but I'm actually going to paint water all the way down here. Not going to worry about going right to the edges of my paper. This is a demonstration. All right, so yeah, there's a lot of detail around this this branch here. I'll come back to that later. I don't need to worry about that right now. But I'm going to be thinking about the that curve, this sort of gentle ripples in the water that are coming in, and you can see this prominent direction. So I'm going to be following that. And my paper's nice and wet. Now this starts to fade. As it goes further back, this starts to get lighter. There's probably a cloud in the sky, or there's just more ambient light and the reflection's getting lighter there. So I'm going to rinse off my brush and make sure that this gets a lot lighter up here. Now keep in mind, watercolor always dries lighter than what it looks like when it's wet. If it looks correct when it's wet, it's going to dry too light on you. So if it's too light, or if it looks right, it's wrong. All right, so you can see that dominant curve in the water there. Maybe change that angle a little bit just by streaking through there. So I'm not trying to make a nice, smooth, even curve here. I want to maybe tuck in a little bit back in here. And I'm looking through the tree at what I can see in the water here. So that's going to go through there. I'm going to blot my brush here, putting some color on it, but I'm blotting it so that I can put some color in that doesn't run all over the place. In other words, my brush needs to be a little drier than the paper. I did pre-wet all of my colors on my palette. There's no way I could be painting this way if my paint if my wells were nice and dry. So I have soaked all of this. My paint is nice and gooey. All right, so let's put in a couple more prominent type ripples here. There's even a couple of cross ripples. So I'll indicate a couple of those. I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to fuss with this because I'm working on wet paper. You've got a finite amount of time to be able to work on wet paper, right? You have to, the paper's going to tell you when you're done because you can't keep painting after it starts drying. So you notice I'm doing some little strokes up in this area up in here. I see, well, that's what I'm seeing is little streaks of blue. Okay, but it's still lighter at the top than it is in the foreground, which is typical because when things recede, they get lighter with atmosphere, and you will feel more of a perspective if you make this not an even wash. So I haven't brought it all the way down to this area here where we're going to be putting in some of the rock and things like that. But I could put a little bit down in here as well. And this part down here, I don't want to show too many ripples because you can see that the water at the shore is much calmer here. All right, so let's give that a dry. Before I get this too dry, I think I want to soften this edge a little bit here. So I'm going to rinse my brush and blot it. Okay, I'm blotting it well to make sure it's pretty dry. And I'm going to just soften up this edge a little bit, just so that it doesn't show through my foliage there too much. There, not very neat and tidy. That's not important. At this stage of the game, you want to make things sort of look close to what we're actually seeing in our reference picture, but remember the early stages of your painting need to be a little wetter, a little bit more spontaneous looking. Don't get into fussing until it's needed. I want to make sure this is thoroughly dry because I want to start considering some of the other elements and taking a different approach to some of the things. You'll know when your paper is dry when it's flattened out again. Thanks so much for waiting for me today. Sorry about being late. All right, that should be enough drying. Let the paper cool down to room temperature again. Now, the next thing I need to look at is relative value. Okay, so I've got in here all of this light green, and I think what I would like to do here, there's a couple of ways I could approach this, but what I would like to do, I think, is to paint in some of this greenery first. I'm going to take a slightly smaller brush. Let's say this one is a number 6 squirrel hair brush. Doesn't have to be squirrel hair. It could be a synthetic brush. That would work just fine for something like this. I'm going to mix up a green, and I want it fairly light, so diluted, in other words. So this area here, I don't want to cover up the white of the paper, so I don't want to come in with lots and lots and lots of pigment in this case. I want it to be fairly transparent. The sun is obviously hitting this part of the tree, and this part of the tree is being shaded probably by other branches. I'm going to go Aureolin. Here, let's take some of that blue, mix that in there. I would say a little more blue. I don't want it too yellowy. It's an evergreen. Evergreens very often will be more of a cool blue or cool green as opposed to a warm green, a more yellowy green. So can I mix pastels with watercolor? Do I ever work with pastels? I have worked with pastels, chalk pastels, and I've got oil pastels as well, but I'm not as fond of those. And but I have not mixed. I haven't done a lot of mixed media in general. I tend to like my watercolors just as watercolors, my acrylics just as acrylics, and so on. I don't know why I'm that way. I don't like to mix my peas and carrots either. I keep them all separate on my plate. But yeah, I've seen other people do it with wonderful success. Well, the one thing that's really nice about using a watercolor wash with pastel on top is it gets rid of that white texture of the paper. When you put pastel down, it tends to capture the what's the word I'm looking for? It hits all the high points on the texture of the paper. So then you're left with a lot of sort of speckly type thing on there. So I'm gonna come in here. I'm not gonna go too carefully here, but I just want to indicate some of the greenery in this section. Now, why am I not being too careful? Partly because I want this to look a little bit more loose than my typical style. Secondly, I really don't need to go that fussy because I'm going to be coming in with quite a dark color, as you can see. I'm going to be coming in with quite a dark color there, and I can cover up a lot of what I'm doing here. So I'm really just kind of painting it in this way just to remind myself the direction of the foliage, all of that type of thing. This is somewhat incidental to the overall picture. However, this tree, having some of this tree in the picture, clearly tells the viewer that this is what's causing the shadow on the water, which is of course why we can see in the water. You ever notice when you get in the water and say you drop something in the water and you want to see what's underneath the water, you tend to put your, shade your eyes like this. You put your hands over on your forehead to shade your eyes. That's so that you can see in the water. So when you see a shadow across the water, that's when you can see under the water. If there's something light hitting the water, like a sky, you're not going to be able. You're going to see more of a reflection, not a like a mirror instead of a window. Okay, so that's a pretty good hint of that. Now as we come over into this area where the foliage is darker, I'm going to get more pigment. I might even tint that a little bit. If I want to tint if I've got a green and I want to make it darker, I can always add a bit of red or orange or anything over here in the warm family would work. I'm going to go permanent rose here. But I need a little more green to start with. Let's make a little more green. Add a little red to it, just a little, and I will get a much darker green, I mean, not blue. It does have blue in it, but I'm looking for a green. There we go. So comparatively, right, comparative value, we've got this lighter green. We need a darker green in here now. So this one, and as I said, I'm just going to do this much looser than my typical style because, we're not here all day. We're just here for short lesson. I talked about doing trees a couple of times in my previous demos. Maybe I'll link one of those in the description below. But you'll notice one thing as I'm adding this foliage, and the same thing happened when I was doing this. Look at the direction of my brush handle, right? My brush handle's always following the direction of the stroke, as opposed to going sideways. Now, sometimes you want that sideways stroke in order to get something like a dry brush effect, which I'm not really looking for here. But my brush handle is going in this direction because that's the direction of the foliage. But I like this variation in the greens. I'm going to add a little bit of that even down in here because right now this looks a little flat, right? So lots of little bits of the water still showing, peeking through those trees, showing through. But it's quite a bluish green for evergreens. I do see a lot of evergreens, even when people are painting say a Christmas card with a tree on it, and it's such a yellowy green, but if you look at an evergreen, they are pretty bluish. Part of that is the local color, but some of it is because the foliage itself is a little more bluish than, say, a deciduous tree. All right, let's try to get this in here a little bit quickly. I won't go into great depth with this, but it'll give you an idea. And if you were painting this on your own, you wanted to make it more realistic, by all means you could take and fuss and really, really work on it. But I'm just trying to get the overall feeling of this. Sometimes we think that we have to paint every detail, and I do that in a lot of my paintings, as you know. I think you have to paint every detail, but much of the time it's not in the detail that makes the painting. It's these general placement of shapes and values that will make or break your composition. Okay, so now we have to somehow intertwine some of this. So let's come in and get some transitional shadows here where we've got, some of this is connecting together. Little hints of this throughout the light foliage as well. And I'm almost out of green, so I think I'm almost finished putting my foliage in. All right, so let's put, I'm just going to use a little bit of neutral tint or something here and just indicate a few branches and a couple of the extra deep shadows. I don't want to put all of my branches over top of my foliage. I have to stop where the foliage is because the foliage in many cases is on top of the branch. Thank you, Bobby. All right, so we'll put a couple of little darks in through here too. We indicated a couple of values in here. I'm going to do the same here in my darker foliage. I don't want to have it looking too flat, so I want to make sure that I've got some variations in here. All right, so that gives you an idea of, that tree there. Now let's take a look at what's happening on the water surface. Okay, I know there's rocks. We're going to ignore that for now. Let's look at the water surface. So there's this really squiggly pattern that's going on the water surface. And this, of course, is the reflection of the light, the sky peeking through the lacy parts of the tree. So in here, it's predominantly shadow with little bits of highlight. Here, it's the reverse. It's lots of highlight or lots of sky showing through with little bits of foliage. So I want to be able to take sort of this dark color and be able to paint that on. But I've got all this little stuff to work around. I don't want to work around that. So I think it would be a lot easier in this case if I were to just take some masking fluid and mask off a number of these squiggles. Obviously, they do not need to be identical to the photograph. It just needs to imply the same feeling. So I'm going to take my masking fluid, which I will stir. I don't want to shake it and get all kinds of bubbles in this, which could cause problems. I just want to stir it up to make sure that any of the color in this masking fluid is blended in, that all the ingredients are, stirred. This, you can see that there's a little bit in the bottom there. That's what I'm trying to mix into the color. You don't want to be dipping your brush in and grabbing a whole bunch of that color. It could stain your paper. So you need to mix it into your color. Sometimes you have white masking fluid, and which is fine. But what I would suggest is put it into a little cup, like one of these little type cups, and add just a couple of drops of something like cobalt blue, because that will make it a lot easier to see on the paper. Okay, I do have a bubble right on top. I'm going to take my masking brush. I like to mask with a brush. I know lots of people use different tools. I'm partial to using a brush. So I soap the bristles. This is not an expensive brush. It's an inexpensive brush, but I do keep it in reasonable shape so that I can paint with a little more precision when I'm doing my masking, because of course that's pretty important. So despite my efforts, look how many bubbles I have in there. That's not good, but I'll have to try to make sure I get them off of the brush before I paint on my paper. I didn't even shake it very hard, did I? All right, there's no bubbles that I can see on there, so that's important. And it's basically in this area here, I want to just wiggle in a lot of these little lines. I obviously don't have to follow any particular pattern, but everything's wiggly. So if you're a person who has a shaky hand, that's probably a really good thing here. But I am going to follow, once again, I'm going to follow the contour of this wave coming in. It doesn't come down right to the bottom. It does stop. And it's a little hard to see what I'm painting here, isn't it? That's one of the disadvantages sometimes to having blue masking fluid. If you mix your own, you probably could indicate like color your masking fluid with a color that would show up a little better on the paper. But you do need to remember, you don't add a color that is a staining color. Otherwise, you're going to be seeing that when you take your masking fluid off. It's going to leave some of that color. I'm using the shakiest hand I can muster up here, and ignore anything like this rock. You're just going to go right over top of all of this stuff. Keeping the brush handle up nice and straight. Sorry, I know that makes it a little harder for you to see exactly the strokes I'm making. I'll try and angle it a little bit. Actually, I've got a better idea. Let's take a look at, I have another camera here and I keep forgetting about it. There, we can look in this direction. Then you can sort of see the strokes reflected in the mirror. All right, so I am indicating, there's lots of little tiny speckles as well. You know, any of the holes in the tree that would be casting a shadow on the ground, or on the water, I mean, are going to be indicated here. All right, and there's kind of a dark spot right there. I'm going to go well up into sort of like, it's hard to show on this. All right, so up in here, I'm gonna take some of these little areas that I'm masking. I'm going to bring some of them up into there for the time being. Not too far, just a little bit. I want to make one thing clear. I am not trying to mask all the edge of this water. I don't need to. I'm only looking at, you know, where these little light bits are amongst the dark. Okay, maybe we can see in the light how much I've got there. I think I need a little bit more than that. So I'm just going to keep going here with some of this. There's a lot of little squiggles in there. This would be really hard to paint around, which is why I think sometimes it's easier just to take your masking fluid and apply that. There's an artist that is really fabulous at painting like this. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but I love the work of Ruki Garab. I don't think she has a YouTube channel, but she does some wonderful water with shadow reflections. She does a lot of this type of thing, and she it certainly takes a lot more time, and I would normally take a lot more time, but we're just here for a quick demo today, so I'm not going to invest a lot of time on this. I can still get the point across without going into extreme detail. You'll get the technique. Got a little bit of a buildup of masking fluid on the end of my brush, so I'm just going to rinse that off, soap it again. This isn't any special soap, by the way. This is, just hand soap, soft soap or whatever. And just going to soap my brush again. And continue on. I'm not going to do very much more. It just needs to have a little bit more. Especially the little bits. I don't want to make it too... This is our human nature, is we want to make everything matchy and all the same, right? So, we need more masking in some areas and less in others. So there's big strokes, little strokes. They're all pretty much squiggly here, but I'm trying to indicate that I'm still following that same curve, though. As I'm applying these wiggly lines, they are still following that curve. I think that's getting pretty close to enough. Just do a little tiny bit more. I'm looking at this reflection here, and I think I can see better on the screen than I can in person. Like looking down on it, I don't see as much reflection, so it's a little hard to indicate. But you could always lean to one side and see, lean to one side and see the glare on it the way I'm using this right now. Could I use a very small sea sponge? I don't think it would give me the right kind of squiggles. You'd have to look at your picture, and I think a sea sponge would give us more of a stippled effect and not these little worm-like squiggles. So in this case, I would say no. I have used a sea sponge for techniques like foliage. Even with masking fluid, you have to get a lot of soap in your sea sponge. But yeah, right. So you can see kind of where I stopped here. I stopped kind of close to the end of the rock, which is how it appears in this. You see the end of the rock here at the bottom, and these ripples kind of stop there. So I'm going to let this dry. It won't take very long because I haven't applied masking fluid very thick there, but I'm rinsing this out of my brush. Get the lid back on my masking. And I'm going to start mixing up some color that I'll need. All right, let's go back to the overhead cam. All right, so the overhead cam, you can't see the lines that well. Masking fluid ruined my brush, so now I use a toothpick. Yeah, some people do. If you ruin your brush, first of all, if you soap it first, you're less likely to ruin a brush. Secondly, if you do ruin a brush, like if this gets too caked, and it has been fully caked at some point, I use Goo Gone, the product that they make that removes sticky label residue from glassware and things like that. You have to work it in a little bit, but you can pull it all out. So I work a little bit in. I take one of those little cups and I, swirl it around in there, wipe it off on my paper towel, keep going, keep wiping off any of the excess, and you can get it nice and soft and flexible and shape it back into its original condition. So it's great for dissolving it, because what they use in adhesive for the those labels and things, the back of a label is basically latex, which is what is in masking fluid. It's the main component, actually, liquid latex. So the Goo Gone will dissolve that. And if you do have a ruined brush, I talked about this last week, you could always turn it into a smash brush. If you don't know what a smash brush is, or if you missed last week's demo, a smash brush is a brush that's been ruined, and you just smash it until it looks terrible, but it makes a great stippler. So you can stipple with it. And so I keep some of my worst brushes just for that purpose. All right, so while I've been talking, it's starting to dry. Now I need a big puddle of this general color. I'm not looking for the darkest color, but I do want to have a couple of colors, or a couple of values, I should say, mixed into, or mixed up on my palette. But I'm looking for some of this light color here, and then I'll be needing some darker color in a couple of places as well. Yeah, there are silicone masking brushes as well. They're like color shapers. It's silicone. Yeah, so they are quite handy too. And the beauty of that is you don't have to soap it or anything. You just use it and it wipes right off. Everybody has their own favorites. So let's take my large brush now, and I'm going to go over into my palette, and I'm going to take a generous amount of burnt sienna. Big puddle. I've got a fairly, almost half of my paper. If I drew a line diagonally across here, I'm going to be covering almost half of my paper. So I want a really big puddle. One of the downfalls of watercolor is when you don't mix enough paint for the application, you have to stop. And while you stop to mix more paint, your paper starts to dry. The size of paper I am using is 9 by 12. This is a block. It's Arches 140-pound cold press paper. So this is nice. It's a nice big puddle of burnt sienna, but we don't always have to use paint straight out of the tube. This is too red. So I want to dull that down. How do I dull it? I can always use the complement. So I already have some of the complement here on the paper, but I'm going to add some cobalt blue, and you'll see that what will happen is that will turn much more dull and brown. Right? So that's going to be a better indication of what I need. I'll take even a bit of Payne's gray and make it further darker. Further dark. Let's use some good grammar here. So I've got my burnt sienna here, mixed with my blue here in the middle of my puddle, and a little bit of Payne's gray over here, just for the darker areas. Right, I want to start with the lighter areas first, so I'm going to work at the bottom. You might feel more comfortable if you wet some of this area first, but I'm going to just jump right in with a nice full wet brush. Really pick up as much color as I can. This is a pretty large brush. Look at the size of my thumb. It's bigger than my thumb. So I'm going to come in and start putting in this general color. I hope all my masking was dry. I think it is. So you'll be able to see where the masking is much more easily. Remember, if it looks right when it's wet, it's going to end up too light. It's not going to be right. So I'm going to go a little bit darker. I'm going to have to mix up maybe a little more paint, which I hate, but I'm going to cover as much as I can right now. So I'm going to come up here. Then, as I'm painting, I'm looking at these little squiggles, and I want to try to transition into that. So I'm just going to take this wash and squiggle up into the other part of the water here. Trying to keep all of these edges wet at the same time is a little bit tricky, but I'm going to do my best. So this is the leading edge right here. This is the part I want to keep wet. It's not as hard as you think. You know how do you keep that edge wet? You just keep adding water to it. Or not water, but you keep adding more paint at that edge. So it's not all that difficult. Again, you can see I'm using the point of my brush to create those sort of squiggly lines. Looks like I got the shakes. And I want to get darker, so let me add a little more Payne's Gray here. And I'm going to start blending some of this up into these details. And this, I really want to have a full brush. I know it seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you don't have your brush full, you won't get this in here without it having a lot of streaks and things. So you've got to have a full brush to get that to flow together. You can see that this is sort of melting into the rest of this. It would have also, another alternative would be, okay, save what you've done here by masking this. You could do that as well. That would have been yet another step, but if it makes it easy, if it makes your life easier, then that's great. You know, if you're not good or you feel too much pressure when you're actually trying to paint really fast like this, masking fluid can be a big benefit. So you can see this melting in here. That's kind of good. I want that to happen. Now, all these little white spots that I left behind, I'm going to touch in with this dark color. Now, this can be a little, like, I've done pretty much what I need to do with this big wash down here. And I just need to start thinking of the little bits of this same dark that are showing through the tree. This is, as I said, this is not going to have the same spit and polish that I often do in my paintings, but it'll get the technique across. If you do end up trying this technique, I would absolutely love it if you would post your version in my Facebook page under this post, under the post where I'm talking about today's live stream. So you can post it there. I would love to see what you do. You can work from your own photo or my reference. This is my reference. You are free to use it. All right, so we need a few more little squiggles out here into the water out here. Again, following that natural curve of the wave that's coming in. This is one time when it's really advantageous not to have a perfectly smooth line. I think I want to go a little darker right in here. It's almost a little greenish in here. It's probably moss under the water. I'm going to just take a little sap green, mix that in. Now, unfortunately, some of that wash is already starting to dry, so what'll I do now? What happens now? Well, I think I'll just soften it in there with a damp brush. And I'm really emphasizing the word damp because if I leave it as it is, it's going to end up with a hard line. If I go in with a wet brush at this point, this is most certainly going to create a blossom. So let's get a drier brush here. So this brush is, you can see it's damp, but it's not wet. And I can lay the brush down and blend that in. And I didn't create a blossom. That's extremely important to remember. If you have a really wet brush and you've got something like this has lost its shine. I don't know if you can see, but you can see it's lost its shine. If I come into something where it's lost its shine and my brush is really wet, that's the recipe for a blossom. So it's not that you can't paint in it, it's that your brush has to be drier than your paper. Since your paper's already pretty dry, you better make sure your brush is quite dry. This is something that you have to practice. It's not something that is intuitive or anything like that. It's a bit tricky to get used to, but it's, you know, practice it on a small demo like this or something. All right, so the only thing I have left to do now is to dry what I have, start painting some of the rocks, and remove my masking. And hopefully we have something somewhat resembling the effect we're trying to get. I don't want to use a lot of heat here though. If I use a lot of heat, I can bake my masking fluid onto my paper. So I'm going to keep this moving the whole time. What mop am I using? I am using I don't know how to pronounce it. It is a number 6. It is DaInyw. Sorry, DaInyw. If you want to know the brushes and materials that I typically use, you can go to my website. It's right here. And I have a page called Materials. There's also a link underneath this video, but you can go there, and I have the brushes, picture of them, and the sources and things like that, description of exactly what I've used. So hopefully that'll help. All right, so this part here is still a little wet. I've just got to get that a little bit drier. There's no masking there, so I can go a little stronger here. That was where I started, and it was really wet. Almost there. Okay, I think it's there. All right, that has to cool. It's a little hot in that one area. But now I want to start thinking about the stones and the rocks, all of those things that are under the water. In some cases, it might even be, dying leaves. If it's at a creek bed or something like that, there might be sticks and leaves and all kinds of things under the water. So as long as you have, the highlight areas preserved, you can work around this. But I'm just going to take this darker brown that I used previously, and I'm going to start indicating where my stone is. Let me pull this down here so that you can see them side by side, or maybe one above the other. That might be easier for both of us to see. And I see that there's a strong shadow on this side. As I paint this, I want to make sure that my brush has got wet paint in it, not a dry brush, because what I want to do is actually soften as I go. So this is unlike working on wet paper. I want to have some hard lines. I want to have the hard line of the rock. So I'm working on dry paper, but with very wet color. And you'll see why in just a moment. Okay, rinse my brush quickly, blot it, and now I'm going to lay the brush down where the outside of those marks are, and I'm going to soften. I could even start out here and walk up to that wet color, and it will soften. So you can see I can actually make the shadow of that rock show up. All right, let's find some more to do. And I don't have to make it exactly like the reference. I certainly do not need to do that. Now, why don't I have strong shadows here? Because, of course, this is in shadow, so we don't have strong light hitting the rocks. So I don't want to have really high contrast in a lot of these things. I'll try and indicate the rocks. The one thing you'll notice I have not done is I did not go all the way around the rock. If you go all the way around the rocks, you're going to end up with rocks that look like they're outlined, like a cartoon. So keep that in mind. You want to not outline everything. You can just hint at some of the shadows of these rocks. But remember to soften as you go. Every time you soften, you lay your brush down and soften the edge you want softened here. So you lay it down only in the soft edge. Don't soften both. Which means you're going to have to skip around a lot, because right in the area outside of that faded shadow, it's wet because I've just wet it. So I have to keep moving around. It's like when you're painting a flower and every petal has to have a, you have to skip over the petals because you can't work one next to one that's still wet. So you have to keep jumping around. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm getting a little darker. As I come up into the darker area, my shadows aren't going to show unless I get a little bit darker with my color. So I'm going to come up here and put in a few shadows. I'm certainly not painting every rock. That would be a little bit excessive. But I have to remember to soften these edges before that edge dries. That's the important part, before it dries. You notice it's either the lower edge or the right-hand edge that I'm softening here. Now as it always happens, I tend to be falling into make them all the same size, the same shape and everything. So you have to make a conscious effort to make some of them bigger, some of them smaller. We do want to make them all the same. When we get into some of these really tiny ones, we can indicate those pretty much with detail without doing a lot of softening, right? So we can hint around some of those small ones just. And I'm still, even with these small ones, I'm trying not to actually outline each one of them because that always looks a little funny, don't you think? I'll soften a little bit of this, not all of it. I can soften parts of it and that will be effective. Now let's move on somewhere else. This is something like painting these rocks in a cluster like this, especially when you're kind of looking down at them, just takes a lot of careful observation. You might be tempted to make them all like little circles, but they're not. We're looking at a slight angle, so one rock overlaps another. So they're not all little circles. They're not all little potato shapes or anything like that. So you have to make a conscious effort to do it. It's a bit tricky. You may find it very helpful if you take a pencil and kind of draw this before you actually paint these. I tend to sort of wing it as I'm going along because I've done a lot of this before, but just to show you some of the ways that might help you if you've never done it before. Draw a couple of the rocks in with your pencil. A couple of the big ones. You don't have to draw every rock. That would be kind of a lot of work. But you can indicate some of these, and especially where they overlap each other. So you won't see the bottom parts of all the rocks because there's a rock in front of almost all of them. Especially when you're looking at an angle. So let's draw some of these shapes and indicate some of these areas. Right, so if I draw some of them in, that's going to make it a little easier for me to wrap my head around, how the structure of these rocks are in the water. And I'm not trying to make it exactly the same. I could if I really wanted to, I could, but I'm not being that precise today. Sometimes you have a wider shadow. So soften these edges. Don't try to take on too many or they will dry before you get back to them. Okay, let's indicate a couple of darker shadows here and there. And you can see how I'm working around some of the drawing that I did there. Things aren't always crystal clear under the water. There's always a little bit of fuzziness in a lot of cases. But we can imply a lot of the fuzziness. And the way I can imply it is to, put in a few strokes like this, for example. Let's not make them all the same size. Make some of them long and so on. And then I can just take my damp brush and just soften a few spots. The little bit of murkiness in the water. Now I'm going to come back in and I need to put form on these rocks because I've got kind of the outline going on here. As you can tell, most of these shadows are creating the look of an outline, which is great, but the rocks look still kind of flat. They look like pieces of brown paper in the water with shadows. So in order to create more of a believable effect, we need to put some texture and things like that on these rocks. So let's soften these edges first. And I want to put some form in the rock. Okay, so when I'm looking at this big rock here, you can see it's got kind of an angular shadow there, where the plane of the rock goes from this to dropping off, right? So it's creating this little bit of a shadow here. Then we've got another plane change right here, and that drops off. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to take, it's basically the same colors, which I'll put in my brush. I'm going to blot it on my paper towel, just very quickly, one little blot. And I'm using the side of my bristle, okay? The side of my brush, and I'm going to do a bit of dry brush, and I'm just going to put in a confident stroke there and basically start putting some shape on this rock. You can see that by using the side of my brush, I'm getting a dry brush effect, and that will give me a better indication of the texture on the rock. So it all depends on your reference. Sometimes you get those in the rivers. You might get something that's if it's something that flows a lot, the stones might be more rounded because over time the water has worn them down into a little bit more of a smooth surface. So you might not use so much of a dry brush technique there, but you can create some of the textures on this type of rock quite easily with this dry brush effect. All right, so let's really show some of this texture, and you can go back over it. If you want to make it a little bit darker or anything like that, you can certainly go over these shapes. I may have to revisit a couple of things, so I might need to darken a few shadows and things like that, but I'm going to just come in, and it's pretty hard to mess this up just because like I said, it's very organic. When you're talking about things like rocks and water and trees and things like that, nobody's going to argue with you that it's not like the picture, especially if you're not showing them the picture. They're just going to see, oh, that's the texture of a rock. I can tell what that is. So you don't need to be exact. I know there's a few of you out there that have that tendency. I'm actually one of them myself, but I just choose to be that way. I choose to make it very precise in most of my paintings. But you can't do that. If you're painting on location or something like that, you have to learn to paint a lot faster. Painting faster does a couple of things. It trains your brain. And what I mean by that is it trains your brain to make quick decisions. And quick decisions are very important in watercolor because sometimes as you're painting, you have to react. You have to react in the moment because, if something isn't working exactly the way you want, you have to decide, do I take that off right now? Do I have to smooth it out? Do I have to, you have to ask yourself a lot of questions. So learning to paint quickly can make your paintings result in more freshness and that sort of thing. You can see I'm coming in with some more darks here. I'm just reinforcing some of my shadows. I have done exercises with a couple of classes where I have basically given a time limit to painting. And it's not the results that we're looking for. It is the training your brain. Yes, it is hard not. Marilyn Jenner says, yes, I tend to go for detail, hard not to. And yes, it is very hard not to. You've got to move along quickly and get the impression of things. So I'm going to do a few more rocks up in here, a few smaller ones as we're coming up into the shadow. I have them drawn in here, so I'm just going to see if I can indicate those pretty quickly. In every case, I seem to be kind of looking at that lower right-hand side of each rock. You know, that I'm making the shadows there first, it seems. So that keeps me consistent in what I'm doing. And I'm going to start implying things as we get further away. And you look at this picture, the further into the water you go, it's getting deeper. So we're seeing more of the sediment in the water and so on. The depth is making it less visible for us to see what's happening in there. You can barely see some rocks as the water starts getting deeper. I want to make sure that there's the indication of some rocks through this area here too. And I think it looks like there's kind of a big one right here. So I'm going to do a large rock right there. My puddle on my palette is starting to get a little dry, so I'm just going to replenish that a little bit. Add a little bit more of the Payne's Gray, because as I get up into the shadows, of course, any shadows I try to add on aren't going to show up very much. But I don't want to have too much detail back in here. So just indicate some of this. Trying to make sure that nothing looks outlined. Lift your brush sometimes. Will I glaze over the darker areas? Yeah, probably a little bit. But more, I think I'm probably going to be doing more dry brushing than anything else. Okay, I just want to make sure I haven't missed any questions. Would I consider light reflections on underwater rocks as the subject one day? Yeah, sure, Jan. This is Jan's question here. Would not know how to approach this complicated subject. Would I consider light reflections on underwater rocks as a subject one day? Sure, there's endless subjects which I could be talking about. Sometimes I am torn between topics as I'm creating these weekly demos, but I'm always open to all of your suggestions. Of course, the ones I get requested most are the ones that I will offer first, but I'll see if I can get to most of the requests. And for those of you that have sent requests, I'm not ignoring any of you. I can only do one topic a week, so that's how it goes. You could spatter, yeah. Spattering depends on the textures that you're actually trying to create. Deepening a couple of shadows, I think, to make sure that I don't have everything too flat looking. I need more than two values. So here, this is basically light, and I've added in sort of a medium value, and I also need to have a dark. So sometimes I have to keep coming back in to redarken things. but I'm going to put in a little bit more dark in some of these areas, and I'm just going to dry brush this in. You can see I'm using the side of my brush for this to create some of these darks. The problem with trying to do an overall wash is that where the end of unless you take it right to the edges, the end of your wash will have a line around it. So it's better to put a sort of a dry brush layer on than to try and do it wet. My sort of general thinking is that you would put drier paint on top of wetter paint, layers, that is, and then you don't put wetter layers on top of things that have indicated some detail, because you tend to lose those details. So I'm not going to do a wash, anything wet at this point. Just want to hint at some of the darker rocks in here, and I may have to come in and still darken. You know, things always dry lighter. It's kind of a really dark section right there. Kind of indicates that those, oops, dropped my brush, indicates that those these are larger rocks, so the shadows of course are bigger. All right, so you get the idea. I could keep going and going, but there's a lot of rocks here. It would obviously take a while for me to do that, which is kind of boring to watch. So I'm going to dry what I have, and we'll take off the masking fluid and we'll see how it looks. Some of these rocks, you see how kind of flat they look? Because I haven't added any of the shadows in there. But these bigger rocks, I added some shadow. So that will make a difference when you go back in and you tend to all of those smaller rocks. These ones over here, there's no masking in that area. I think I'm done in all the areas where I have masking. I think I'm done that, so I'm going to remove this masking. Let's see what we end up with. So you can see that we've been able to successfully create the look of dark against light and light against dark. And using the masking fluid really helped with that. And you might find when your masking fluid comes off, oh, you know, some of these areas really should be, like maybe I've got too much, or maybe I want to break it up. So see, there's less of this light indicated than what I actually have on the masking. So the solution will be to simply come in and paint in a few of those spots on the light areas only. I'm not going to try to double up some of those darks, but I might just break some of these spaces up with some of that same initial brown color. Hopefully you masked properly and you wouldn't have to do this, but you know, life happens and you may have to come in and indicate some of that. So I'm only painting on the blue areas, basically that lighter blue color. So I'm just kind of breaking up the spaces, which will make those, I don't have to try to cover them up, I just have to break them up. They will feel a lot more sort of tiny and delicate, which is kind of what the reference indicates. Don't try to wash over any of this, because anywhere where you overlap this brown with the other brown will give you a dark outline on some of these. So that would not look right. There. So now it's looking a little bit less prominent there. It looks a little bit more natural. It seems to connect more with what I've got up here for continuity. Could I do more? Sure, I could. I feel like it could be a little bluer. If this is fully dry, I might be able to put a little bit of blue in there to darken it slightly. Let's try a little bit of that just to show you what I mean. The reason that it got lighter is because of the masking fluid. The masking fluid will lift a little bit of color. So I'm coming in. Now this could get a little bit tedious, but just to show you that I could come in with a little bit more blue if necessary. But ideally I could have made this a little darker in the start to compensate for the lightness of the masking fluid. But I love making mistakes in my demos because it happens to all of us. And if I don't make a mistake, then you won't know what to do when you're faced with one. And it's not a mistake. It's just, you know, something unexpected happens. Like your blue is too light. So I'm just coming in, and my brush is pretty dry with color here so that I don't start creating blossoms or anything like that. But I'm just going to come in and almost with a dry brush, I'm coming in over some of those blues. So now you see that this blue is a little bit more in tune with the other. All right, so I could come in and indicate more shadow on these rocks. You don't have to be too fussy about it. You just need to make sure that there's some value changes. You need to have 3 values minimum to create the form. The bigger rocks tend to have darker shadows. Soften any edges you need to create there. Don't want to cover up any of my highlights there. I just want to make that a little darker. Make sure you've got some variety. Light, you've got some shadows, but there's darker shadows. So you want to make sure that you have more than one shadow value. Put it that way. Okay, so I think that gives you the idea how I've duplicated, to some degree, I've duplicated what we're showing here. Yeah, and there, I'd like to maybe do another demonstration at some point where you've got sort of trees reflected and you see through the water, even in the highlights. That could get a little bit more complicated, but I'd love to show that another time too. By all means, give me any of your suggestions for future demos. I would love to see what you are interested in most. And if you appreciate this demo and my other demos, I've got lots of them. You can always check that out, by the way, on my live, the live tab on my channel. You can see my past demos. And yeah, so I'm going to wrap this one up for today. And thanks so much for joining me. Sorry I was a little late, but better late than never. And we'll see you next week. Bye for now.